Empress Xyra of the Zithari Empire stood tall in the grand throne room, her face a mask of regal serenity, though inside her blood boiled. The council chamber was packed with high-ranking officials, alien diplomats and advisors who whispered among themselves, all waiting for the inevitable announcement that would bind her to a creature of legend, a barbarian, a warlord, a human. She had heard of their kind. Humans were a primitive species from the distant Sol system, yet they had spread like wildfire across the stars. Unlike her people, who prided themselves on their superior intellect, advanced technology, and diplomatic prowess, humans were unpredictable. They thrived in war, conquered entire star systems, and turned desolate planets into thriving colonies. They were resilient, fiercely independent, and, most of all, terrifyingly resourceful. And now she was to marry one. "The decision is final," Grand Chancellor Varys declared, his voice echoing through the chamber. "To ensure the survival of the Zithari Empire and establish a lasting peace with the United Human Territories, Empress Xyra shall be wed to General Doran Vale of Earth." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. The Zithari were one of the most advanced civilizations in the known galaxy, their empire stretching across hundreds of systems. Yet, their war with the humans had cost them dearly. The once proud fleets of the Empire had been whittled down by the sheer tenacity of the Terran forces. No matter how many battles they won, humans simply refused to surrender. And now, in the name of diplomacy, she was to wed one of their warlords. Xyra clenched her hands into fists at her sides. "You would have me wed a barbarian?" she said, her voice cold as the void. "You insult the bloodline of the celestial throne by suggesting this madness." Chancellor Varys bowed his head slightly. "With respect, Your Imperial Highness, it is not madness, it is survival. The humans do not wish to conquer, but they will not be subjugated. Their general has agreed to this marriage as a means of forging an alliance." Xyra's piercing violet eyes burned with fury. "Agreed? Like a man would agree to wed a prize handed to him?" "Perhaps," Varys admitted, "but he has made no demands of the Empire. That is a show of restraint not often found in humans." Xyra's heart pounded. She knew her people had no choice. If this alliance failed, the humans would continue their relentless expansion. The Zithari were losing this war, and no amount of pride could change that. Still, she had to see this General Doran Vale for herself before she would believe he was anything other than a savage warlord seeking to claim her throne. The marriage ceremony was arranged hastily. Within days, a Terran diplomatic vessel arrived, docking at the Imperial capital's orbiting station. The human delegation was small, but their presence sent a ripple of unease through the palace. Xyra stood in her royal chambers dressed in ceremonial robes of deep crimson and gold, her silver hair woven with delicate chains of pure stardust. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, but she would not bend. The door slid open, and Varys entered, bowing. "He is here, Your Highness." "Send him in," she said coolly. The moment the human stepped inside, Xyra felt her breath catch. General Doran Vale was not what she had expected. He was tall, his frame powerful and battle-worn, his presence commanding yet strangely controlled. Unlike the hulking brutes she had envisioned, he carried himself with a quiet confidence, his piercing green eyes scanning the room as if he could already sense her disdain. His face bore the marks of battle, an old scar tracing his jaw, but his features were undeniably striking, rugged yet noble. He was clad in formal Terran military attire, the dark material hugging his powerful frame, and yet there was no arrogance in his stance, no smirk of victory, no leering hunger for power, just a man, standing before her, unreadable. "Empress Xyra," he greeted, his voice deep, steady. "It is an honor." She narrowed her gaze. "Is it?" His lips twitched, the closest thing to a smirk she had seen. "Not entirely, no. I imagine this is as unpleasant for you as it is for me, but neither of us is here for personal satisfaction. We are here for our people." She studied him carefully, searching for any sign of deception. "And you accept this union? A warlord shackling himself to a throne he cannot claim?" His eyes darkened. "I have no desire for your throne. Earth and its colonies do not seek to rule your empire, only to ensure that this war does not destroy us both. If a marriage is the price of peace, so be it." Xyra had expected a brute, a conqueror. Instead, she had found a man of measured words and quiet strength. She hated that it intrigued her, and so with a heavy heart she extended her hand. "Then let us see if peace can truly be forged from war, General Vale." His strong fingers closed around hers, and for the first time, Xyra felt something unexpected. A spark. A dangerous, undeniable spark. Xyra stood at the center of the grand ceremonial hall, her posture rigid, her heart a storm beneath her composed exterior. The air was thick with murmured conversations, the gathered Zithari nobles casting veiled glances at their empress and her human groom. Across from her, Doran Vale stood with the same quiet confidence he had displayed upon their first meeting. His powerful frame, clad in the dark finery of Terran military formal wear, seemed almost out of place against the delicate, ethereal beauty of Zithari architecture. The ceremony proceeded with the precision of an ancient tradition. Xyra recited the vows in her native tongue, her voice smooth yet edged with steel. She had performed 100 rituals in her life, but never had one felt so wrong, so heavy with unspoken defiance. When it was Doran's turn, he spoke the words in fluent Zithari, his pronunciation impeccable. That alone sent another wave of unease through her. Had he studied their language, their culture? She had expected an ignorant warrior, but he was something else, something dangerous. The moment of truth arrived. "The bond must be sealed," the high priest intoned. "By the sacred decree of the empire, your union shall be witnessed and made eternal with a kiss." A hush fell over the hall. The Zithari were not a species that displayed affection publicly. A kiss, even a symbolic one, was an intimate act. Xyra swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing herself to stand tall. This was duty, just duty. Doran stepped closer, the heat of him palpable even through the cool air of the chamber. His green eyes studied her, not with arrogance or demand, but with something unreadable, something that made her pulse quicken. "This is merely formality," he said quietly, so that only she could hear. "You don't have to." "I know my duty, human," she snapped. And then, before she could let herself hesitate, she leaned in, pressing her lips to his. It was meant to be a fleeting touch, cold and mechanical, but the moment their lips met, something shifted. His breath was warm, his presence steady. There was no force, no demand, only an unexpected gentleness. He didn't seize her, didn't attempt to dominate the moment. Instead, he let her dictate it. The touch was brief, yet electric, sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with fear. When they parted, Doran gave no reaction, no smugness, no triumph, just a quiet understanding. "The bond is sealed," the high priest declared. The chamber erupted in polite applause, but Xyra barely heard it. She turned to face the crowd, her expression composed, yet inside her mind raced. What was this man? Later that evening, Xyra sat in her private quarters, staring out over the vast cityscape of her capital. The skyline shimmered under the twin moons, a breathtaking sight that had always soothed her. But tonight she felt restless. The door chimed, and Doran stepped inside, his imposing frame casting long shadows across the room. He had changed into simpler clothing, still Terran but lacking the rigid formality of his uniform. He looked different, less like a warlord, more like a man. "You didn't come to admire the view," she said without turning. "I came because we should talk." She let out a slow breath. "We are bound now," he said, stepping further into the room. "You may hate this arrangement, but we are allies. The least we can do is try to understand one another." She turned to face him, crossing her arms. "Understand? You think you can understand me, human?" Doran tilted his head slightly, considering her. "Maybe not, but I'd rather not live in a palace of silent warfare either." His directness caught her off guard. She had spent her entire life surrounded by courtiers who spoke in veiled words, who maneuvered like vipers through political games. Yet here he was, stating plainly what he wanted. "Fine," she said at last. "Speak." He moved to the seating area, taking a seat on the cushioned bench. "Why do you fear my people?" She stiffened. "I do not fear humans." He gave her a wry look. "Then why did you expect me to be a monster?" Her jaw tightened. "Because every story I've ever heard of humans tells me you are exactly that. War, hungry, unpredictable. You burn entire worlds and take what you want." Doran leaned forward slightly. "Then you've only heard half the stories." Her eyes narrowed. "Oh, and what is the other half?" He exhaled, studying her for a long moment. "That we fight because we have to, because the universe doesn't offer peace freely. We build, we adapt, we survive, and when we make allies, we keep them." His words carried weight. They weren't spoken to convince her, but simply because he believed them. Xyra hated how that made something shift inside her. "You think this alliance is real?" she asked. Doran met her gaze. "I think it can be, if we choose to make it so." She had expected arrogance. Instead, she found something far more dangerous: conviction. For the first time, since this entire arrangement had been forced upon her, she felt something other than resentment. Curiosity. Doran Vale was not the barbarian she had feared, and that unsettled her far more than if he had been. The days following the wedding were a blur of rituals, meetings, and carefully orchestrated diplomatic engagements. To the outside world, Empress Xyra and General Doran Vale were the perfect symbol of unity, the fierce ruler and the steadfast warrior, bound by duty to forge peace. But behind closed doors, they remained something else entirely. A silent battle raged between them. Xyra had spent her life mastering the art of control over herself, over her empire. She was not accustomed to being challenged. But Doran challenged her in ways she had never anticipated. He did not bow to her whims like her subjects did. He did not cower before her, nor did he attempt to dominate her as she had feared. Instead, he stood his ground, strong, steady, infuriatingly unshaken. And worse, he treated her like an equal. That unsettled her more than anything. The Grand War Council met in the Imperial Chambers, the vast circular room filled with the highest-ranking officials of the Xythari Empire and the United Human Territories. It was the first official strategy meeting since their wedding, a chance for both sides to discuss the future. Xyra sat at the head of the table, dressed in the flowing silver robes of her station, a crystal diadem resting on her brow. Beside her, Doran sat clad in a sleek yet practical military uniform, his broad shoulders squared, his expression unreadable. The discussion began with formalities, trade agreements, resource distribution, military cooperation. But then the conversation shifted. "We should consider a more permanent deployment of human forces on the border worlds," Admiral Ruek suggested. The old Xythari commander, a traditionalist to the core, cast a wary glance at Doran. "After all, if we are allies now, your forces should prove useful in patrolling the outer systems." Doran's green eyes remained calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to his voice. "Your empire has held dominion over those regions for centuries. If we suddenly station human forces there, do you not think that would provoke unrest? That your own people might see it as an occupation rather than an alliance?" Revik bristled, his mandibles clicking in irritation. "We have the right to protect our borders." "Peace is not maintained by force alone," Doran cut in smoothly. "If this alliance is to hold, it must be built on trust, not the presence of warships." The room fell silent. Xyra watched him closely, something unspoken passing between them. He was not here to conquer. He was not here to demand control. He was here to build something. And, God's help her, she found herself respecting him for it. This alliance will only succeed if both sides recognize the other's autonomy, she said at last, her voice cool but firm. General Vale is correct. We cannot afford for this to be seen as submission. We will find another way to ensure stability. Ryvek inclined his head slightly but remained displeased. Doran gave Xyra a subtle nod, acknowledging her support. It was the first time they had stood as one, and it would not be the last. Later that night, Xyra found herself in the royal gardens, her mind restless. The moonlight bathed the crystalline flora in a soft glow, casting long shadows across the intricate pathways. She was alone, or so she thought. You handled Ryvek well today. The deep voice sent a ripple of awareness through her. She turned to see Doran standing at the edge of the garden, watching her. You were watching? She asked, arching a delicate brow. His lips quirked slightly. You're my wife. I take an interest. Something about the way he said wife made her skin heat. She shook off the thought. Ryvek is a relic of an old empire. He believes strength is measured in fleets and armies. And you? Doran asked, stepping closer. What do you believe? She exhaled slowly, watching him. I believe strength is the ability to adapt. His gaze flickered with something unreadable. Then you and I are not so different. Xyra let out a soft, almost bitter laugh. We are entirely different, human. Doran stepped even closer, until they were only a breath apart. Are we? The tension between them crackled like an unseen force. She should have stepped back. She should have reinforced the walls she had spent a lifetime building. But she didn't. Instead, she studied him, the scar that cut across his jaw, the flecks of gold in his green eyes, the way he watched her as though he could see past the armor she wore, past the Empress, to the woman beneath. Well, do you do this? She asked softly. Why do you speak to me as if we are equals? Doran's voice was just as quiet. Because we are. Her breath caught. For so long she had seen him as a necessary evil, a piece in a political game she had no choice but to play. But now she saw something else. Not a conqueror, not a barbarian, a man. And that terrified her more than anything. Because it meant she could no longer ignore the truth. Doran Vale was not the monster she had feared. And perhaps, if she let herself, she might not hate him at all. Xyra had spent her entire life in control of her emotions, of her empire, of her very destiny. She had been raised to rule with icy precision, to never let personal feelings cloud her judgment. Yet now, standing before Doran Vale, she felt anything but in control. It had been days since their conversation in the garden, yet the memory of it lingered, pressing into her thoughts like an unwanted intruder. He had not pushed, had not demanded anything of her. He had simply stood there, looking at her as though she were something more than just a ruler. And that terrified her. But even more terrifying? The fact that she no longer wanted to push him away. The turning point came sooner than she expected. A week after the War Council, Xyra and Doran were scheduled to make their first public appearance as a united front, a diplomatic event attended by both Zethari officials and Terran representatives. It was meant to be a display of unity, a chance to show the galaxy that their alliance was real. But not everyone wished for peace. The explosion ripped through the grand hall just as Xyra and Doran stepped onto the ceremonial platform. Chaos erupted, the air filled with smoke and the screams of terrified guests. Xyra barely had time to process what had happened before she felt herself being yanked backward, strong arms wrapping around her as a second explosion detonated near the entrance. She hit the floor hard, Doran's body shielding her from the blast. For a moment, her ears rang, the world spinning in confusion. Then, through the haze, she heard his voice. Xyra? Xyra? Her vision cleared to find him crouched over her, his face tense with concern. Are you hurt? She shook her head, trying to steady her breath. No, I'm fine. He exhaled sharply, relief flickering across his face before it was replaced by something far darker. Stay down, he ordered, rising to his feet, his hand going to the weapon holstered at his side. Doran. But he was already moving, his instincts those of a warrior. With terrifying efficiency, he scanned the chaos, his expression sharpening as he assessed the situation. Assassins, he muttered. Probably extremists from one of the separatist factions. Xyra clenched her jaw. There had always been those within her empire who opposed the alliance, who saw her marriage to a human as an insult to the Zethari bloodline. And now they had made their move. Doran turned back to her, his expression unreadable. We need to move. For the first time in her life, she let someone else take the lead. They fought their way through the palace corridors, Doran leading her with unwavering focus. He moved like a man who had lived on the battlefield, his every step calculated, his every decision precise. Xyra had always been taught that humans were reckless, that they threw themselves into danger without thought. But Doran fought with purpose. By the time they reached the secure chambers, the palace guards had regained control, the assassins had been neutralized, but the damage had been done. The event was in ruins. The illusion of stability shattered. Xyra turned to Doran, her heart still racing. You saved me, she said quietly. His green eyes met hers, unreadable as always. Of course I did. Her fingers curled into fists. Not because of duty, not because of politics. He was silent for a long moment. Then, no, her breath caught. No pretense, no games, just a simple truth. For the first time in her life, she did not know what to say. That night, Xyra found herself standing in the doorway of his chambers. Doran was seated at his desk, a data pad in his hands, but the moment he saw her, he set it down. Xyra? She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. For a long moment, she simply looked at him, at the man she had married out of duty, at the man who had become something far more dangerous. You are not what I expected, she said softly. He studied her, his expression unreadable. And what did you expect? A brute, a conqueror, she hesitated. A man who saw me as nothing more than a prize. Doran exhaled, leaning back slightly. And now? Now she saw something else entirely. A man who had stood beside her when she had no reason to trust him. A man who had fought not for power, but because he believed in something greater. A man who had protected her, not because of duty, but because he wanted to. And she no longer wanted to fight him. Slowly, carefully, she stepped closer. I don't know what this is between us, she admitted, but I want to find out. Something shifted in his expression, something raw, something real. He stood, closing the space between them in a single step. Then we will. She met his gaze, her heart pounding. For so long she had believed she was bound by chains. But now she wondered if she had simply never let herself fly. And maybe, just maybe, Doran Vale was the only man who could teach her how.